So it's a great pleasure to be here today with Jonny Parker. So hello, Jonny. How are you?
Yes, yeah, I'm very well. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm very well. Thank you very much. We're obviously here to discuss the concepts of self-development and future-proofing yourself. And I'm really keen to find out how Jonny has developed and managed himself so far in his career and through his educational days. And I'd love to find out what you've learned along the way, who's given you great advice and perhaps who hasn't given you very good advice. And if you went back, what advice would you give someone in a similar role to you, setting out on your sort of journey? Plus also to finish off with how you feel you're going to go about continuing to develop yourself to stay relevant and value for the rest of your working career, when or however long that may be, because I guess we don't know unless we can get a really damn good pension fund going pretty darn quickly. So the first question is could you sort of give us a bit of an overview about education and career and your story so far?
Yeah, no problem. So I went to Exeter. I won't go back too far, but I went to Exeter and studied law. I did an undergrad degree there, 3 years. I came out like mid 2-1. Very much enjoyed the degree. It's quite a vocational degree, but I'll go into that some detail later on. And then just on timeline, I took a year out after my degree. I paralegaled for about half a year in Jersey, where my family are based. And then I did the classic gap year sort of route and did a lot of sort of Australia and Indonesia and traveling, and lived and worked in Australia for about 5 or 6 months. Came back to the UK. I should add that before I went off traveling, I already had secured a training contract offer. So I knew I had to be back by September the following year to start at law school. So then I did my year of law school, otherwise known as the LPC, which is the practice course. So it's kind of like the practical application of the law degree. And then I'm on a 2-year training contract, which finishes in September this year. And then I'll be qualifying as a solicitor, and then you go on sort of beyond there and specialise in your area. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Is there any particular area that you feel that you would like to specialise in?
I think I'm going to follow the sort of corporate commercial law route. I've done a couple of seats which have had that kind of focus. The way it works with your training contract, you do sort of 4 6-month rotations through various different departments, and you have to do some that are contentious, so sort of like disputes and court-based work. You have to do one which is corporate, so that's sort of like transactional work and businesses and mergers and so on. And there's more niche seats you can do as well, but they're the ones which have sort of really taken my interest in the commercial side and like working alongside businesses, both in sense of when they're at vital stages like buyout, or when they're being sort of launching like an IPO, or when there's also sort of alongside their day-to-day business activity on the commercial law side with their like contracts as well.
Wow, it's certainly interesting stuff, and lots of stuff to keep you involved in sort of all different areas. And I suppose as time goes on, you can specialise even further into certain areas.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the purpose at this sort of stage I'm at the minute. The sort of immediate goals are sort of qualifying and finding an area which sort of keeps a lot of doors open, and then you sort of find your sort of speciality a couple of years down the line from that, as opposed to sort of going in sort of massively niche very early on, and then finding out it's not for you. So yeah,
that's really important. So if you can go back to your university days and sort of your working life expectations sort of 4 or 5 years ago to what they are now, what was the difference?
I think one of the biggest things which sort of took me by surprise was right up until you've left university, you've had education that's been always sort of very programmed for you, and there's always been like a curriculum, and there's always been, this is when my exams are. And I think since starting work, although I was very aware that I was starting quite a structured job in the sense that you have these sort of set milestones of at 2 years you qualify and this is what you need to do it. It still was a lot more independent. You had to be a lot more self-motivated, and you sort of drive your own opportunities and find your own interests. There's people who job it is to sort of help you with that, like in the HR teams, for example, but it's a lot less spoon-fed. And if you don't find it at the end of the day, you've only really got yourself to blame, or maybe it's not the right area of career for you. So I think that's one thing which was a big step up, was you're going to be sort of independent in that regard.
Yeah. And how have you found your levels of motivation in dealing with that?
You have sort of like a wave. So you have times when you're sort of, if you're, for example, in a seat that you're not enjoying as much, you'll be less motivated and you'll be thinking, oh, why have I got to wait a certain amount of months to get back to a stage of something that I'm really sort of driven by? And you have to be the one that manages that. And the hard thing with law particularly is you, at the end of your training, you have to basically reapply to the area that you're interested in. So it is effectively, they call it a 2-year job interview. So that's quite a long equivalent of an internship or something. So you have to really be sort of saying, continually thinking, come on, how am I getting on versus where I wanted to be right now, and keeping yourself motivated. But if you have a genuine interest in it, it's a lot easier.
Yes, you've got to have that passion for it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So this may sort of be a similar answer to this question, but what's the most important thing you feel that you've learned, in your university and working time, that you now use in your daily life?
I think one of the biggest things I learned was sort of the importance in law of critical thinking. I think it's something that gets built up indirectly through subjects. If you're studying sort of humanities subjects, your English, your histories and so on at university, or at A-level, you can really sort of develop an understanding, but it's never specifically focused on in a curriculum. And that's been a massive part of the day-to-day work I'm doing, is sort of looking at something, analysing what the key issues are, and then reaching some sort of judgment on that. So yeah, I think that's something that people should really be emphasizing early on in their sort of academic careers, making sure they're getting that critical thinking education.
Yeah. Okay, I like that. And it's sort of, but I suppose that comes with experience, and as you said, from coming from a different environment where you're not being spoon-fed, that you've got to think in a different way, and learn a different process to thinking. Whereas perhaps in the past, as you said earlier, sometimes you can get spoon-fed and you can just absorb it and just regurgitate it, whereas now you're having to think differently.
Yeah, massively. And there is, like you say, there's an element of sort of learn by doing, and there's another element of sort of learn by shadowing and watching other people who are sort of later on in their careers and finding out what judgments they'll be sort of reaching, and you sort of by osmosis sort of pick a few of those up. But there's a lot of, when you're applying for these jobs, they quite often have these critical thinking tests and so on as well. So if you are relying on picking that up when you've actually started the job, you might not get through the door in the first place. So I think it's something people should be sort of making an effort to reach out and do themselves as well.
No, I like that. That's great. So you sort of moved on to that a little bit with my next question, is sort of, working with other people. So who's given you the best advice, or what has been the best advice you have been given in your working career so far?
So I've been quite fortunate, because I've had a couple of people who've sort of served as kind of like mentor figures for me throughout my career, both in a sense of like technical legal training, but also sort of wider career skills and sort of BD skills. And one of the main things which stuck with me, which was linked to what you were saying about a sort of different way of thinking, was from one of the partners at the firm where I'm doing my training contract at the minute, who said, it's all very well using your legal skills to be able to hone in on what the issue is and what the problem is, but if you're coming with problems to other people in the department, you're just creating more work for people. And the sort of learning with that was, don't come with problems, come with the analysis and the suggested solutions. And even if your solutions are far off, they can correct that way of thinking, but they want you to be helping sort of to ease the burden for everyone else as much as you can. And that's really stuck with me. It's sort of being a solutions as opposed to a problem bringer.
Yeah, and I think that's so important in life quite often, that we can always sit here and go, oh, it's rubbish and this is wrong and that's wrong and why isn't that, end up talking like politicians arguing over Brexit or whatever. This is wrong, that's right. Okay, yeah, but what's the solution? Well, that's up to them to sort out, or I'm waiting for someone to tell me. Yeah, you've got to drive that solution. And I think, yeah, your seniors will definitely appreciate you for thinking that way. And there again, that helps to fast track yourself as well. So what aspect of your work so far have you enjoyed the most?
Well, one of the bits which I've really enjoyed, I'm doing at the minute. I'm on a client secondment, so they send you out the office for 6 months off to one of the clients. So I'm at Amazon in their legal team, and it's a massively different environment in the sense of you're on the other side of what you'd like to be receiving as a legal service. Yeah. And the whole decision becomes sort of business risk and PR. And it's just a completely different style of thinking, which I think will really influence when I go back to private practice, being able to think about how we are delivering our service to clients. So that's that. I've been doing that for nearly 2 months now, and got to the end of September. But yeah I'm learning a lot at the minute.
I've got to be careful how I word this. So has sometimes the profession been guilty of not seeing it from the other perspective?
I think it can be, in the sense that lawyers are often taught to get really into the detail and think about what the real issues are at hand. But if they're getting into too sort of minute sets of detail, they might not be thinking about whether or not that business is particularly worried about that risk. So there's almost like a commercial next step of all the legal skills of figuring out what all the risks are and presenting them to the client. But there's that commercial step about, is the client particularly exposed to that risk? Will they particularly care about that risk? There's no point going into real detail about a PR risk coming from a legal issue to a really small startup if you don't think they're even going to be on the press's radar at that point. And it's an expensive mistake to make for the client if it's something that they're not bothered about and they're paying an arm and a leg for it.
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah. So what's been the most challenging aspect of since you've left university and well, I suppose you are working but still studying and learning. But what's been the biggest challenge?
It's quite a challenging career in a day-to-day sense, and that's one of my favorite things about it, in the sense that I'm genuinely academically challenged every day and find myself scratching my head. But the biggest challenge is probably it's very sort of fast-paced. There's a lot of urgency, and you have to really, like, time management is super important in the sense of juggling 8 immediately urgent sort of queries and issues, and that's again something you pick up as you go along, and you can pick it up from other great lawyers and seeing how they deal with it and figuring out what really is urgent, what's not. But I find, compared to university or school, you have urgency, you know when it's coming, it's very predictable. It's going to be urgent around exams, it's going to be urgent around your coursework deadlines, which you're given at the start of the year. Whereas it can be a lot more unpredictable. You can have something come into your desk in the morning and it needs to be out by the afternoon, and you'd have spent your whole weekend sort of planning out how nicely your week was going to go, and that's not how it turns out pretty much most weeks.
Yeah, and it is that prioritization, and also realizing that, if I get and working out on average how many major critical pieces of work suddenly land on my desk very quickly, because that's something that never goes on our to-do list, is it? As you say, when we're sort of thinking at the weekend, or got all this and this is going to be nice, but every week you get quite a lot of critical demands, so that always needs to go on your to-do list, and so you can prioritize, and it is that constant juggling, isn't it? So you work on the ones that make the biggest impact.
Yeah, exactly, and it's a dynamic process, and you can you can plan all you want, but like you say, you're never going to know what's coming in. So
Yes, yeah, yeah. So if you could turn the clock back before you started working, what advice would you give yourself, or perhaps someone coming into the role, sort of, that you've and the steps that you've made? What sort of advice would you give them?
I think generally, my general advice would be sort of beyond law, would be make the most of when you're at university, or if you're not going to university, through your sort of school network or other sort of business networks, and make the most of the beyond academic training that's available. I think there's a lot of careers workshops, there's a lot of sort of open days you can go to, and they're so valuable from that sort of commercial perspective. You can come out with a first class degree from one of the best universities, but if you haven't understood the way a law firm, for example, operates,
Yeah,
and the sort of service you're offering to clients, you're not going to get in the door in the first place. So being well-rounded in sense of sort of commercial awareness is massively important. From a legal perspective, I'd say don't be confused that every law firm does the same thing. When you're applying for law firms, you should be really considering what the difference between the firms are and why that would suit you.
yeah,
That's the largest part of the application process, really. If you've already demonstrated your interest in law, you've already demonstrated your academics, they need to know why you've chosen them out of the 50 odd top law firms in London, for example.
yeah.
So yeah, just sort of specifics and some real reflective thinking about the kind of industries that you're interested in and the
And
types of
also
law,
quite a
which
bit
can
of
be hard
research.
before you know that much.
Yeah,
There's
and quite a
there's a
bit
lot
of
of research that
research,
goes into that.
rather than just turning up and thinking I'll wing it, because they will see past that.
Yeah, and don't just rely on like a reputation of something. And if you go in and just regurgitate stats about good awards that people have won without a genuine interest in the work they've done to do it, again,
Yeah,
they'll just see straight
yeah,
through that.
yeah. Okay, that's brilliant. So that's given us sort of a really lovely taste and overview of how you've developed yourself and your journey, which is great. And you certainly do seem to be, you know, very self-aware of what you've been doing, where you're going with it, which is always great to see. But where do you feel your environment is going to change in the next months, years, perhaps working practices, perhaps, yeah, you know, the profession? Is it going to adapt and change much, do you feel, like most other organisations and industries are?
Uh, I think law firms are just catching up to this sort of wave of technology and working practices, which some of its other counterparts, such as accountancy firms, have been a bit quicker on the uptake. So I
Yeah,
think the sort of flexible working styles, sort of hot desking, things like that, and now things which law firms are starting to consider, and candidates are starting to ask questions about and almost expect that sort of focus on well-being. So, but I think on a wider sense, law's very exposed to technological changes. So we've now got things like virtual courts where they can settle really minor issues. They've got
yeah,
AI contract review systems which can pull out various clauses from contracts, which was basic entry level work that people such as myself would be doing. So there's going to be a change in the role of the solicitor, particularly the junior solicitor. One of the best ways to sort of counter that and get on with it is just basically really skilling up on those tech systems early on, so that when it comes to how does this software does X, Y, and Z, but how does it work, you could be one of the experts on that. And there's
yeah,
going to be levels of human input that are required anyway to make the judgment calls and to train the machine learning, for example, which is still going to require human skills, especially at least for now.
yeah.
So
So I mean,
I think being tech literate quite early on.
yeah. And do you see that's your key to you staying relevant and value, you know, for the future, is being able to apply the academic technical side with the technical in terms of computers and everything else, and also your social ability to interact with all those different people, sort of like a three-pronged approach?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's legal expertise, it's commercial skills, and it's an understanding of the technological changes that you can make client service a lot more flexible, cheaper, a lot more direct. And if I'm being perfectly honest, it's very easy in your training contract to focus on the academic side and the commercial side, and I probably have been too much. I've been sort of doing various courses on the technological side of it to understand some of these sort of leading platforms, but I haven't been really diving into them as much as I probably should be. So that's an area which I can improve on for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. Okay, that's good. There again, you have incredible self-awareness of what you have been doing and what you need to do, and that's really good to hear. And I think a lot of people don't always have that. They can get very blind to thinking about their abilities and their skills and their weaknesses, and actually, instead of realizing that it is changing quickly, I need to adapt. And I think that's really quite important. So, to finish off with. I think it's fair to say that in the working environment, age diversity has never been so huge. Not just in the amount of years people have been at work. So you've got perhaps people in their teenage years coming into the working environment, and you've got people in their 70s still at work. But also the way those different generations think and interact and deal. Have you sort of, what have you found? Has worked and hasn't worked in those areas. And when you talk briefly about having some good mentors at the start, what's worked and hasn't worked for you with observing the different generations work?
It's a very good question. I think there's a massive role in that mentoring of it being like a two-way process. So there needs to be, it's very easy in my position as a junior to get quite a lot out of mentoring, in the sense that I can sit there and watch someone who's laid out a lot of their career and find out about the mistakes they've made and find out about what they were stayed known at my stage, and really sort of absorb a lot of that. But I think it needs to be a two-way process. They need to understand, coming in as a junior, how do you see the market changing, and how do you see lawyers, good lawyers, being able to react to that? So it's very easy to say juniors need to just be able to understand the tech, but you need to be able to explain that and explain why you think it's going to impact the market, as opposed to simply teaching someone how to use a platform which they might not really understand the importance of.
Yeah.
And there's is definite, as I said, law can be a touch old school at times. So you'll meet people who have quite sort of set ways of doing things, and can almost be a bit tech resistant. And there's a people management element of that, and it can be quite hard coming in as a junior if you have someone who's in quite a high stress environment, who might say, like, just get this done, I need this done by end of the day, to take that quite personally. And that's part of that emotional learning which is taking place when you're working, that you'll understand that that's not necessarily meant to be a personal comment, and you should sort of be able to distinguish between sort of general business stress, almost, I'd say, and sort of a personal issue.
Yeah,
So yeah,
yeah, yeah. And I
people
think, yeah,
management.
I mean, it is a fascinating topic. I mean, it's a topic that I find particularly interesting in lots of organisations. And I was talking to a senior partner of actually of a firm of accountants, and I was talking to him about reverse mentoring, where, you know, more senior people actually, yeah, they mentor the more junior ones, but also flipping it, as you say, so it's a two-way process. And you'd have thought I'd reinvented the wheel. He just thought, wow, that's such a great idea. Why aren't we doing that? And he's starting to look around to all his other partners. Well, why aren't we doing this? And it's, yeah, just, yeah, it's a cultural thing in certain organisations. Some are very good at doing it, and some aren't so good, and don't always see the value. Because this is why I love doing these conversations with yourself and, you know, people of your generation, and starting out into your careers, because I learn loads from it as well. And you know, people say, "Oh, that's a good idea. I've never thought of it that way." And being more open-minded, and this is one of the real important things of these podcasts, is open people's minds to, one, things change very quickly, and how we're adapting. And that's what I particularly like about your self-awareness and what you said early on about keeping the doors open as you go along, and seeing which way things are going to go, and perhaps being able to react quickly, perhaps more quickly than we were in the past, because things do change. And also, I think it's good that you have been so challenged in your work. And I love the bit about your placement. You said at the moment it's a totally different environment, helps you to see it from the other side, which sometimes in business we forget that, even in law there's a customer,
Yeah.
that we've got to provide value to. And yeah, certainly your networking is very important. And I do like what you talk about, being really well-rounded. And I think also what I find is a huge issue in so many companies is the commercial awareness, or the lack of it. Because a lot of companies, we're becoming so task focused on just our own area, we don't know how that impacts the end client. And the lack of commercial awareness and risk awareness is, that's something that really does surprise me in a lot of companies. So any other thoughts on the way that, obviously we're in lockdown, we're working from home. How have you been coping with that yourself?
It took me a few weeks to sort of get into the habit of it. I hadn't really worked remotely that much, just because the role of a trainee solicitor, you need to always have quite regular supervision, and that's part of the requirements for qualifying as a solicitor. So we hadn't done that much. So it did take a couple of weeks to figure out sort of best practice with it. I found things like sort of setting your morning routines. It's quite helpful. I was quite lucky. I've got all the tech, so I've got like a remote setup. I've not really had any difficulties logistically at all. I think sort of staying in touch with everyone is such an important part. Amazon have been very good. We've had a lot of sort of regular video calls, both sort of on a social side, but also on like a daily work catch up. What work are you working on? So you don't feel quite as isolated in that regard. Also, just I think staying positive throughout it. We will come out of this at some point, having some sort of fun stuff. So you're not taking it too seriously. So I do the opposite of dress down Friday. I always put a shirt on Friday. Just, to get you in the mood. It's quite easy for Friday to blend into your weekend otherwise, if you're there in your PJs or your gym kit.
Yeah.
So yeah, I always put a colour on Friday. And so yeah, generally after the first few weeks, got used to it, got settled into it. But I do miss the social person contact, and that'll just come. We'll get back.
Yeah, good, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. Really enjoyed talking to you, and you've sort of some real good nuggets about keeping the doors open. The networking and the commercial awareness that I've certainly taken away from this. And I wish you all the best. You're obviously very self-aware and have clear plans and aspirations, and I dare say you're going to continue to work hard to make sure that they happen.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, you take
Cheers,
care.
David.
Thanks for your time. Thank you.
No worries at all. Have a good one.
Thank you.